So welcome, everyone. We are so happy you are here joining us. If your computer is not muted, could you please do so, so that we don't have outside noises. And then at the end, we will have time for questions and maybe answers. And I thought I had this set up so that everybody could be automatically let in, but I'm going to have to be reaching forward because it seems like people are still joining. So.
It's fine.
Yeah, no problem. I'm going to mute people who've not muted themselves.
Oh, we can mute them.
Yeah.
Self-mutation.
Oh, that's terrible, Richard. Okay, so we'll edit that part out if we ever get around to it, which we probably won't. But tonight we have a lecture or a discussion that we were thinking was kind of interesting, which is the idea of residue, because this period in history and actually all the time in the world, there is a lot of residue. And especially in the United States this last week, we've been feeling a lot of residue from things because the election just is over, almost, although we've had some resistance from one of the participants. Yeah. Anyway, that's a whole nother lecture.
That's a lot of residue.
It's a lot of residue. So we just wanted to look at residue and what it actually is and why it is a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So residue, the word in Sanskrit is, there are two words. One is shesha, which you've probably heard, and the other is vishesha. Okay. And the vishesha is the particular unique thing that is this present moment. And so what it means is that whenever we think, or whenever even we're thinking, what we're doing is we're ignoring the initial manifestation in the present moment, the arising of that which is unutterable, that if you were actually just feel it or look at it or hear it or experience it, you would be stunned. You go, wow. And so I can call it infinity, but then if you look at something and you think, oh, that's infinity, then you have the idea of infinity going around your mind, and you're not paying attention to that which is actually arising. And so the art of yoga is to stun the mind through practice into stopping the process, at least momentarily, of reducing things to theories about them. Otherwise, what happens is that when you have a theory, it can't really embrace or explain. And so the thing in itself, or that which is sacred, the whole thing, flows out of the category and then spills out and becomes what is called shesha, which is residue, and that which cannot be reduced to something. And then if we look at it and we say, oh, there's some shesha, we've just tricked ourselves, because the category shesha, you put reality into that and it just totally spills out of it. And so any kind of category or thought or subtle or complex is just like a scaffolding that creates this structure of mind, of time and space. And then yoga is delightful when you actually experience what you're experiencing in the present moment, and you've suspended the reduction process where you're going to make it into something else, even if the something else is a really great name like Shesha or Residue or whatever you want to call it. Reality will spill out. And ultimately, in yoga, even if you have the best categories or the best reciprocals, the more sensitive you are, the more you realize as soon as you categorize it, it all spills out. And one of my favorite metaphors, which some of us have heard, is it's like a noodle that's infinitely long, an infinite noodle, and you just try to put it in a spoon, and even a gigantic spoon, a huge spoon, a spoon bigger than the universe, is it so wide that you can put that noodle of infinity in it without any spillage. And then you have to put the spoon inside the spoon, and it all spills out again. And so Nirodha in yoga is that stunning where you cease the process of making time and space. And in that process, you start to, what do they say? Some metaphors, you eat the shesha, you digest the shesha, you have a direct experience of shesha, and then that is considered to be the middle path, or the esoteric path of the Tantra, which opens up the central channel of the body. So it's very stunning, very wonderful. And if you understand it, you can understand it conceptually, but probably you've got to practice in order to actually get stunned by what we'd say, the beauty of Shesha. Mm-hmm. Even any category you say there'll be the part of the mind will say, well, it isn't beautiful, it's really stinky. So whatever you say, the intelligence of mind itself will leave a kind of shadow or background. And when you actually come into the middle path, you start to experience all of the residue or the shadows from all of the thoughts, complex and simple, that have been created.
Yeah, and the last couple of weeks we've talked a little bit about abhyasa and vairagyam, and the idea in yoga practices is that when the shesha arises, which is the residue between things, that is that opportunity to set things down and to either, depending on what form of practice you might have been doing, whether it's an asana practice or a chanting practice, pranayama, etc., to drop into the body and allow the residue to do its thing, which is a process of assimilation, because it is the unknown and the unnamed. And the moment you start to name it, as Richard's been saying, then it's no longer the residue, because you've defined it. And so
even if it's a good name.
Yeah, and the art form is to be, we've talked about being comfortable with not knowing, and this is where we train ourselves in this art of not knowing and becoming comfortable with that, which in this particular year in history, not knowing has been like number one. One of the number one things in many of our lives is we don't know what's going on and when things will shift, etc. And so when we start becoming comfortable with shesha, then we become more comfortable with not knowing, which is part of the practice. So in the asana practice, that's why the finishing postures are so important. It is, and many of you who've worked with us have heard us say time and again, you know, it is just incredibly important that you really give them their due.
Yeah, so the classical yoga pattern is abhyasa, in which you make a sacred space with probably the intention of, I'd love to have some shesha. Um, but then, at the very end of the practice, you have to then do vairagyam, which means you give it away, almost as a sacrifice or a gift to others. And in that process, you're supposed to offer your entire mind and the entire background and the entire universe and all of the good and the bad. And then, if you can really relax and go, let the shesha just be there. It radiates. It's like the sun shining. And that's a very important step in yoga. In fact, you don't really have much yoga going on until that happens. Oh dear. And so that is the release or the letting go. And into not knowing. And then if your mind says, well, I wonder what it's like to not know, and it makes an idea of what does not knowing look like? All you know for sure is that's not it.
And we think in the bigger picture, oh, okay, the shesha happens when we're doing the finishing poses. So that's when the assimilation of the practice happens in the nervous system and in our minds. And you may have experienced, you know, you have a problem that is in the back of your mind, you do your practice, and then at some point in the practice, it starts to get resolved often. Not always, but often. And that is because the place we identify the shesha happening is in the finishing poses. But actually it happens, you know, on the wave of the breath, on the wave of the asana, the vinyasa between poses, or moving into one pose and out of another, or one side of a posture into another. There is just this infinite wealth of subtlety that the mind can get captured by, rather than getting taken off into its tangents of conception. And so it's really important as we do our practices to notice the points where the mind has let go enough to start to process things.
Yeah. And many of us have the experience of hala hala, which is what happens when your practice starts working and you actually start to feel the residue, which is kind of in the sensations or in the prana, in the body. And this is how you actually feel. And sometimes our story of ourselves is so glorious or so sad or so much just theory that the intelligence is making in the background all of the counter stories. Like you might say, oh, I am so sad, or I am so wonderful, or I am so terrible. And your mind in the background is creating kind of, not necessarily the opposite, but the complement to that. Everything is flowing up, while in the background of the mind, just as much is flowing down. And so then when you experience the hala hala, is you actually start to feel how you actually feel, which is a combination of maybe elated, proud, scared, happy, neutral, all of these different feelings that don't fit your storyline and cause, you know, this sense of like, initially, as if you've been poisoned, or as if you were fearful. But then if you can relax and follow the middle path, which is the esoteric or the deeper yoga, then the digestion of the hala or the poison of samsara is like the cause of enlightenment or great joy.
And we wanted to use this sort of metaphor, although it isn't actually completely metaphorical, that the shesha, or the residue from practice, is what makes sort of a biofuel within our own practice, but also within our own lives. And switching slightly to a different metaphor, if you start looking at what it is like to have a compost heap. Many of you are gardeners, and we have a compost heap out in the yard, and what is it that is a compost that makes something a compost heap? And it is all of the leftovers that you put in to this pile of things. And depending on where you live, like when I was a kid, I grew up in Florida, and you just piled, leaves and duckweed and stuff on top of it, all these piles of things. And within no time, it was this rich soil. Here in Colorado, where it's dry and cold, it's a lot of work. You have to think about your compost, which is really difficult to do. But what I have learned from that is that to make the rich soil that will then be the food for whatever it is you're going to grow in that soil, you pay attention and keep the compost balanced. In other words, keep the residue in check a little bit, so that here we might need to, on occasion, water the compost. On occasion, if it gets too cold, you have to turn it, and you have to heat it, and you have to add dry leaves, etc. And you all know that's how you make a compost heap. But when we think about it in our own practice or in our own lives, we don't really think about the fact that it is in those moments where residue arises, whether it's within a yoga practice formally, where we are coming in and out of a posture or doing the finishing poses, or whether it is when we are, taking whatever residue from our practice, that feeling that sticks with you for 5 minutes to, the entire day, depending on many factors. When you take that out into the world, how rich and how substantial will that residue be? And within that space of the residue of the moments that are revealed within the yoga practice, the richness there is what allows us to interface well with others and to really do what we need to do in the world. And so what you find is that there is residue everywhere. It's in our own bodies, it's in the mind, it's in the cultures that we live in. In other words, if you look historically, in a sense, at a culture, there is huge amount of residue there.
History or bodies, whether they're subtle bodies or your gross body, they're compositions of residue, like a samskara is residue. And yoga is actually the art of skillful residue making, kind of like in farming, where you're cultivating something and you're not quite sure how to explain it, but you've had occasionally a taste of it. So it's something very familiar. And it's like a little creeper, a little plant And it's the plant of the central channel. It's the plant of love, or the plant of actually the experience of interconnectedness, direct experience. And then it requires the skill in that you want to pull out certain weeds. There's a tension that's required, and that's the art of yoga, the art of action. And of course, you understand that you are not your body, and you are not your mind. And so the artist there is this subtle story of who you think you are, even though ultimately that isn't you. It's just an impermanent creation of the mind. Still, there's an art to it, and that's what we're doing. So the fuel is, the art of compost, and so we're composting sensations in the body. And we're actually learning to observe them without the mind immediately running off with them. And then we also have to compost our religious attitudes. Now and then, you get a used formula, a used dharma, and you compost it. And what you get then, just to the laws of nature, is you get an upgrade when you use it, and then you get the next generation in terms of evolution. So,
yeah, and in addition to the body and to the mind and our theories, one place we experience residue is in what it's a hard word to come up with, but you might say something like our spirit, or our, and I don't mean, what I mean is our connection and to what feels true and meaningful, that definition of spirit has this element of residue that is part of it, and that really is fueled by our ability to compost all of these other parts of our experience day in and day out. And so that when we are interfacing in the world and we have cut ourselves off from certain parts of ourselves, perhaps things like truthfulness, that has been really, there has been an affront to truthfulness that has been worldwide in the last 4 years or so. This idea that truth doesn't matter. And that is something that if you take that piece of information and you plant it in the composting sort of environment of your experience in the world, of your embodied experience, it can grow something that is very toxic, turn into something that is very harmful. And so, and when things like that, and we'll talk about some of the seeds that you can plant in this good compost that you might make through yoga and awareness. But when you allow the compost to just kind of be haphazard, then you run the risk of kind of going off kilter, and of it. I'm flashing back to this horrible thing we bought once, which was a great idea, but it didn't work. And it was an in-home compost machine where you could, that was warm, would warm the compost up, and you would put stuff in and it would churn it and warm it up. And somehow it was supposed to work, but boy, after about 2 or 3 weeks of having it, it turned into the most foul, dreadful stench. We ended up having to almost like call, the hazmat team to get rid of it. but
If we had thrown our egos in.
yeah, maybe
Speed,
it's
yeah.
too late. We gave the machine away. But what was missing from that was light, was sunlight.
Was in discriminating awareness, just that basic wisdom. I was just thinking that the word for lotus flower, one of the words for lotus flower is pankja. So panka means mud or shesha. And so lotus flower is that which is born out of this residue. And then you get this beautiful creative lotus flower, which is the potential growing out of your own navel.
Yeah.
And that's good composting.
And so one of the other ideas that we wanted to throw into this sort of odd little metaphor that we're spinning is that when you have a garden and when you are planting things, you plant either seeds or seedlings usually. And in our own experience, we have all kinds of seeds that we plant in the residue that we create within our approach to our world. And that is why, one of the reasons why it is so important to bring some conscious awareness to this aspect of the unknown and to the aspect of that space between things that is the residue, that is the assimilation and the joining together of things. And in that soil, if we have given it the light of consciousness, if we've given it, watering in a way, by practicing rigorously and practicing gently, but rigorously, that we, that the seeds of our own dharma, our own circumstances, fall into this soil that is our life, that is the richness of our life. And the seeds of, what would be called the swadharma fall into that as well.
Swadharma would be your deeper, subtle body, which is said to transmigrate, still composed of prakriti. And so it isn't actually you, but it is that which carries, good and bad seeds with it, good and bad samskaras, on and on and on. So it's the deeper core of your creative principle is swadharma, your subtle body.
And so these things are things that we really need to consciously place in the richness of our embodied, our mindful, our spirit, our spirited, our cultural residue and compost, so that they are tended to, rather than just sort of letting them.
And we tend to it internally, with our own immediate experience, but then in our relationships with other beings, of course, other people, they do seem to have some effect on you. But also, don't limit it to people. It's all of nature. It's all of any being. There's still that relationship there, and so that carries a lot of, because we think about each other, all those thoughts carry a residue, and then you keep extending out culturally, and so our cultural bodies, are all historical, and there's everywhere you go, there's a little bit of residue that needs to be, that if people actually start to communicate between peoples, and then, if between species even, or between planets, if you want. All of that carries with it the digestion of residue, the composting quality. And from that, you get a continuous upgrade with no limit as to how wonderful it is, because the essential nature of it is that unspeakable joy that is the stunning of the present moment.
And one of the really fortunate things is that because we practice, because we think, and the mind is just constantly going, because we take actions, and actions have an incredible amount of residue attached to them, sort of the karmic chains of events. That is a three-dimensional experience of the impact of residue. Because we are alive, we're breathing, and we are continuing to interface in the world, there is, for each one of us, sort of an unlimited supply of residue that we can then start to cultivate and make this, make this compost that, my life is compost. That could be the name of our next book.
Compost me.
Yeah, compost me. Well, that's our last book. But yeah, please.
But not today.
No, but we have this sort of unlimited supply of sort of the ability to have very, very rich, transformative sort of fuel all around us to really grow as human beings. And so we've talked about seeds like our dharmas that can be planted in there. But then another level of seed that sort of falls into whatever compost we've created in our lives is our seeds of sort of human nature, of the natural sort of tendencies and gifts that are human, like the ability to love and like the ability to have compassion, the skills of communication, the skills of careful thought. Those are seeds also that drop into this fertile or unfertile soil that each of us creates. And so, and the analogy doesn't have to go on forever, but it's yeah, but it's kind of a nice way to look at it, because it is so important to nurture those aspects of being alive, especially in a world where things are difficult, which is 2020, which has been historically, when you start, one of the things we've been forced to look at in this year is that the world has historically had some really difficult periods in it. And if we can come from a place of richness as individuals, then we can navigate those difficulties more easily.
And help others to get that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So we wanted to do a couple of little exercises with you. One of them is very, very simple, because, before we do it, maybe we could say one more time to really allow yourself in your yoga practices to feel the residue. Like if you are chanting, and we're going to do a chant at the end, to feel the embodied experience of that resonant tone of the chant in the body itself.
Yeah, which could be through touch or sound.
The vibratory quality.
Yeah, the immediate
Yeah.
quality of it.
And if you're doing a meditation practice, to look at when the practice is over, to really take a moment to pause and to relish whatever it is that is presenting itself. And sometimes in a meditation practice, it might be kind of dullness. And sometimes it might be something extraordinary or profound, and something unexpected that is just filling the nervous system. And either one, whether it's a dullness or something that is incredibly insightful, they're wonderful. They're the residue. You can't experience one without having the other. And then in our asana practices, to really, truly not run away from the finishing poses, to give them their due, to give, if you're doing, the classic 2-hour practice, which many of us have time for and many of us don't. But however long your practice is, make sure that you really allow all the nerve endings in your body and all the breath patterns in your body to mellow out in those practices. So we wanted to just show you a couple of simple things that you can do to remind yourself about what residue feels like in the body. Do you want to do that?
Yeah. So this is
one of Richard's favorites.
This actually, I just want to make sure that.
Hit me.
Yeah. Okay. So this is actually from Kumne, which is a Tibetan yoga practice. And with, of course, good alignment, heart open, kidneys open. You interlace your fingers and you imagine you've placed a little bit of glue in the roots of the fingers. And then, we're only going to do this briefly, but on your own you can practice this for 10, 15 minutes. And then as with the breath smooth and the eyes steady and smiling, you start to try to pull your hands apart, but the glue is very strong. But it doesn't bother you, or does it? Someone glued your fingers together, but you're pulling. Of course, your heart is open and your kidneys are open. And you're pulling now with some noticeable force. But still, maybe the skin is stretching a little bit. Keep the pen, front of armpit up.
Breathe.
Really pulling. Why did I put my fingers in the glue? Oh, it's stretching a little bit, but who knows? All of a sudden,
Residue.
float. Empty gaze, open ears, floating. And that's the best part of the posture. And so this can be done. That was a very quick version, but it's also
And it's
the
so that
complementary opposite is then manifests.
And the residue really is where there's no name for it. And at that moment where you're, the sensations take over, there's no name for it. Another version of that you've probably done, that we did as kids, when you stand in a doorway and you have the doorway on either side of your arms. This is a great one. And you do the same thing. And you can do this more quickly, where you push your arms into the doorway for maybe the count of 15 as hard as you can, and then step out of the door. And there you go. So they're just kind of fun reminders, but also they stun the mind. And that's something that is required if we are going to really benefit from residue, if we're going to use it as biofuel in our lives.
Don't worry, you're not your mind. That's just prakriti. Daily prakriti. And you're not your body, so what's the problem?
So here's another one for your body that we love. And this is actually something that if you're stressed out or very, very tired, exhausted even, that can feel really good. And the residual sensation is something that wakes you back up to what's present. So take your fingers like so and place them on your temples. And you can close your eyes if you like, or leave them open. And then just over the course of a minute, so I'm going to keep talking here, I want you to take your hands and fingers and rub the sides of your temples as fast as you can, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And you don't have to pay attention to what it's feeling like here, but just keep that motion going on the side of your head. And it's hard to think like this, but I'll try to keep talking. And you do it 10 more times, 5 more times, and then stop and feel. And it's silly, but it's also really grounding. You can do that on your temples, you can do it on your forehead, under your nose. If you do that in meetings and stuff like that, people, especially this one, especially these days, it's a little weird, but you can do it just to kind of relax. And then, residue. So we wanted to leave you also with one thing that is, before we chant, that is a practice that I sometimes do at night, especially if I'm having difficulty sleeping. And that is to welcome the residue from the day, so that in a way, our days are our practice. We do our whatever yoga practices we do in the mornings or in whenever we do them. And then we go out into the world, and that's really where the practices happen. And as you may have experienced, as I have, everything in the world that I encounter doesn't always go the way I planned. That's not true for you, I think.
Yeah, I've heard about
that. From me, I complain about it. So we have days or we have periods of time where things are difficult or where things are wonderful. And so the difficult things leave their residue in our bodies, in our spirits, in our minds, in the cultures that we're in, as do the wonderful things. And so when I can't sleep, and maybe this would be helpful for you, as you lie down at night and just as you're dozing off to sleep, to bring the mind into the body, just do a quick body scan, feel how you're feeling, and then drop into the breath for a few rounds. But then in your mind, imagine and remember each little thing that you can, starting with getting into bed. So starting from the last thing you just did to getting out of bed in the morning. So, and don't get too obsessive with it. Don't get too perfectionistic with it, but sort of, just step by step, the things that have that spring up in terms of, oh, this happened. And imagining it being poured into the sort of well of consciousness that is really the place within your body where residue is processed, is in the deep core of the body, where we can allow the mind to soften and allow the mind to let go, so that the body and the mind work together with the breath to process it. So just almost as if you were the compost bin and you're pouring, each event, getting into bed, and then you might imagine brushing your teeth, and not, just little bits of them, but then the bigger things, that horrible interaction I had with so-and-so.
The things that left an impression.
The things that leave the impression. And not to make it into a big deal, but to realize that that is all the fuel that gives you insight, that during your period of sleep, that those things can get processed just as our practices get processed in the courses. So it may help. If it makes you feel worse, please don't do it. If it makes you feel better, that would be wonderful. Or it may not be of interest at all.
Another practice is chanting.
Yes.
And so we're going to chant verse 64 of the 4th chapter of the Hatha Pradipika. And so if you like, you can find a good copy, a good translation of it, and go back and read all the preceding verses and then all the verses that follow it to get the context. And so this is a chant to the middle path, Sushumna, and then Kundalini, and Sudha. All of those are represented as goddesses, and then it is the that which is born from the moon, which is up at the root of the palate, which is compassion. Manonyanye Namastuvyam Mahasha. And then this gives you the state of the mindless mind, which is whatever you think that is, it isn't. Because all reality slips out of that definition. Mindless mind. But it is all the great Mahashakti. And remember, Shakti is that which is vibrant, and the goddess, who is the Mahashakti, is the creative energy that is most wonderful. Okay. Om Sushumnayai Kundalinyai Sudhayai Chandrajanmane Manonmanyai Namastubhyam Mahashaktya Chitatmane Om. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.